All right. I would like to know who's your hero? You don't have to answer out loud. Please don't. But yeah, who's your hero? Think about that for just a second. If you were a young boy living 100 years ago, I can bet your hero would have been Babe Ruth. You know, the Bambino. Like, everyone loved baseball's Babe Ruth. For a whole generation, that was true. If you were a kid in the 80s, your hero might have been Michael Jordan, number 23. You might have I modeled my basketball game after him. And a generation later, your hero might have been LeBron James. If you're Caitlin Clark, your hero is Maya Moore. And if you are here today, your hero might be Caitlin Clark. That's how it works. We all have heroes. Some heroes, are big and famous, Some heroes are small and relatively unknown. I have a lot of obscure heroes. When I think of preaching heroes, I have some guys you may have never heard of before, but they're heroes to me with how they handle the text. I have a dad hero in my life. He was a guy in my church, and when I was a teenager, I just watched how he parented his young kids. With gentleness and firmness, he would whisper in his ear to his kids, like when they were doing something wrong, and I could watch the kid, and I could see his eyes, knowing that it wasn't going well for him. But that dad never shamed his kid or publicly. I just took note. I'm like, that's dad hero kind of stuff. No yelling, no screaming, just gentleness and sternness. It's a hero to me. I had a boss hero. When I used to work in college, I worked at 1-800-Flowers. And I was not a designer, but I was a flower processor, okay? I had hit the big time. And my boss, Meg, I learned a lot from her. One of the things I learned from her is she let me go. She just was like, here's your job, go do it. And as I excelled in the processing of flowers, she increased my responsibility. And I learned a lot about allowing people underneath you to have a lot of rope and to send them free to go do their work. She's a hero of mine. My integrity hero is my dad. My dad was a man of his word. If he said it, he would keep it. He was a man of integrity and honesty. You never had to question with what my dad said if it was true, if he was making himself just look good. That wasn't my dad. My dad was a man of integrity and honesty, and it's a hero to me in that way. We've all got heroes in different areas of our life, and I want to know, who's your hero of the faith? A spiritual mentor, maybe? Maybe a former pastor or a family member? Maybe as a grandparent? Who's your hero of the faith? A friend? Today's text in Hebrews chapter 11 is often referred to as the Great Hall of Faith. It's like the heroes of the faith. So many have looked at this passage like the Cooperstown of baseball, the Cooperstown of the faith, except with less statistics and debating. It's the Hall of Fame for the Christian faith and for God's people from ancient years past. It's the Hall of Faith. And the author of Hebrews is going to grab onto each one of these in the Hall of Faith and show us how they had faith in God. Now, you might be here today and you think, oh, great. He's going to talk about some people who are just awesome in their faith, and that's not me. My faith is weak. My faith is small. I can't be like these heroes of old, the ones in this hall of faith. And as we read today's text, you might be discouraged, actually. It might have the opposite effect for you. But I want to encourage you, hang in there with me. Because by the end of the message today, I hope that you will be greatly encouraged, and that the author of Hebrews is going to shatter your view of the hall of faith, that you have to hang in there today. And so hang in there with me. All right, we're in our series in Hebrews, and Hebrews was written 30 years or so after the resurrection of Jesus. I remind you of this every week. It's written to Jewish Christians living in Rome who were tempted to abandon Jesus and go back to Judaism. And so last week we ended with, in verse 39 of chapter 10, he just gave a warning, a pretty stern warning, and he ends it with this. But that's not you. You aren't abandoning the faith. I believe that your faith will hold true. And he says this, you're not going to abandon Jesus because you have faith. And that sets our tone for today's text. It's all about faith. He's going to work through the key men and women in the Old Testament and see their faith. And this passage is like this master sermon, and it needs to be read all together. But because, I'm going to be up here already, and because my brother Mike here has a radio voice that would be super interesting to you, I asked Mike if he would just read all 40 verses of it, as opposed to my not radio voice, right? I asked if he would read all 40 verses for us. And as he's reading, I want to encourage you to grab a pen or a pencil and circle the word faith every time you see it. You're going to keep busy while Mike is reading, okay? Every time you see the word faith, circle that. All right, Mike, would you come and read the 40 verses from Hebrews chapter 11?
Thanks for not mentioning my radio face. Hebrews 11. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. By faith Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice than Cain, through which he was commended as righteous, God commending him by accepting his gifts. And through his faith, though he died, he still speaks. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. And he was not found because God had taken him. Now before he was taken, he was commended as having pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. By faith, Noah, being warned by God concerning events as yet unseen, in reverent fear, constructed an ark for the saving of his household. By this he condemned the world and became an heir of righteousness that comes by faith. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, to Isaac shall be your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to even raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked the future, blessing on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob, when dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, bowing in worship over the head of his staff. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw that this child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith, he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab, the prostitute, did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. And what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. All these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God has provided something better for us, that apart from us, they should not be made perfect.
Thank you, Mike. Let's talk about faith, shall we? I mean, this is like the master sermon on faith today by the author of Hebrews, and I just get to offer up a few comments. And let's go back to the beginning of chapter 11, and let's look at faith. I mean, he starts the text right out by faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. There's a couple words here that are really helpful to us as we think and launch into his introduction about faith. The first one is assurance. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for. You know what that word insurance means? Assurance, excuse me. It's a legal document that functioned as proof of the transfer of property. It's an assurance. It was a document in the ancient world that you grabbed and said, that property was yours, it's now mine, and I have this document to prove it. And then he talks about this conviction. This is convincing evidence. This is the evidence that Exhibit A is presented in a court of law and says, this is the evidence that will convince you of the case that I am making before you today. So we have a document and a convincing evidence, and that is faith. And so the author of Hebrews has been saying that Jesus gives us a rightful place in God's presence, and we're sort of like property owners. We own a piece of heaven. We, with Jesus, get to go right in the presence of God the Father Almighty. And so in a sense, you own a piece of heaven, of the kingdom of heaven. And so what he's saying here is, what's the proof? Okay, I've been telling you that you own a piece. What's the proof? Faith is your legal document. Faith is your convincing evidence. So here verse 1 is really a description of faith, of what it does for us, of how it functions for us. It's not really a definition of faith. So how would we define faith? Well, one theologian defined it this way. I'm going to put it on the screen because I think it's the most helpful definition that I've seen. Faith is active trust and belief displayed through obedience. Faith is active trust and belief displayed through obedience. Another commentator said, faith is more than intellectual assent, but it does involve a declaration of truth. This is why we said the Apostles' Creed together today. There is objective truth that's involved in faith, but that's not it. Faith has at its core the idea of trust, and then we obey based on whom we trust. And this is what we see in this hall of faith. We see active trust. Every one of these men and women that the author is going through, every single one of them has faith that results in some kind of trust, that results in some kind of obedience. Now, there is this, I often see threads in texts, and the author of Hebrews in here in chapter 11, he weaves a thread throughout chapter 11 that sort of, if you pull on this, it kind of pulls these ideas of faith together. And the thread that he weaves through here is the idea of the seen and the unseen. The seen and the unseen. You're going to see invisible and visible, seen and unseen, known and unknown. These concepts come up over and over and over again. The visible for the author of Hebrews is this world that doesn't trust God and persecutes followers of Christ. The invisible is another world, the realm of God, and that world, the invisible, is accessed through faith. So when we live by faith, we live in the awareness that the invisible is actual. The invisible is real, and in fact, the invisible is probably more real than the visible. And we have faith in the God of the invisible. So our faith is proof that we're living parts of God's team, and we trust a God we can't see, and our faith is proof that he exists. So let's just now, as he set this for us, let's just walk through the hall of faith together. And let's just look at all these different people, because the author is going to start at the beginning of the story of the Bible. Abel's just about as close to the front of the story as we can get. And then he's going to weave this through the entire Old Testament. And let's just kind of walk through it together and look at what he's talking about. So the first character in the hall of faith is Abel. And if you remember the story of Cain and Abel brought sacrifices to God. And God looked on Abel's sacrifice with regard, but he did not regard Cain's sacrifice. Now, if you read Genesis chapter 4, you might be confused. You go, what was wrong with Cain's sacrifice? I mean, Abel brought the first of his animal. Cain presumably brought some kind of grain, it says, or he was a farmer as opposed to Abel, who was like a rancher. And so we see this, but in Genesis, we don't get a real clue as to what the problem was. And the author of Hebrew helps us here. The author of Hebrews says, Abel trusted God's instruction and was obedient. Cain trusted himself, and so Cain got mad and murdered his brother. And that's why the author of Hebrews says, from the grave, his faith in God still speaks. Abel believed the God he couldn't see. And then we move forward to this cool character Enoch in verse 5. He says, by faith Enoch was taken up. Enoch is such a cool character. If you were reading in Genesis, you'd be like, who is this guy? And in verse 5, he mentions what happens in Genesis chapter 5. And there's like 3 verses to Enoch. And all we know is this, verse 24 of Genesis chapter 5. Enoch walked with God and was not, for God took him. And if you were a Jew or a Christian living in the first century, you would know a lot about Enoch because there had been a lot written, a lot of commentaries essentially, a lot of extra biblical literature that filled in gaps. But what the author of Hebrews sees here is he trusted God and God took him. He didn't die. Enoch transcended the visible to the invisible without dying. He did this through faith, a faith that pleased God. And now, the author of Hebrews is going to stop for just a second and give us this cool verse in verse 6. He's going to say, oh, by the way, Enoch pleased God. His faith pleased God. Guess what? Without faith, it's impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God must believe he exists and rewards those who seek him. And so here in verse 6, we see the essence of this gospel hope that you and I hold on to. This gospel hope, this message of salvation that we believe that Jesus, being fully God, came here to this planet as one of us, fully God, fully human, and he gave his life. The very people he created killed him. And like, as Christians, all of our faith, all of our hope resides in this belief. If you want to grab hold of that document of assurance, it's faith, it's trust, it's believing, yes, all my hope is in Jesus. And he says, draw near, believe. There's a future promise of the invisible type. You can't see it. So we got Abel, we got Enoch, and now he continues with Noah. I mean, God basically said to Noah, hey, I'm going to bring a judgment on the entire world. Things are going very badly. And at that time, that judgment was unseen. In fact, he says to Noah, go build a boat. And so Noah goes and builds a boat in a world that perhaps had never seen rain yet. And at this point, he's building a boat in the middle of the desert. And people are like, you're crazy. And for 120 years, he built the ark. Why? Because God told him to. He trusted God for this invisible, unseen event that was coming, and he kept at it. He was living as a stranger in a land that wasn't his, even though God had promised it to him in the future. He was looking forward to a day he couldn't see, a land, a world that was not yet his. And so by faith, the unseen God was going to do something in the future, and Noah responded. And then we get Abraham, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham. Abraham's the father of the Israelite people, the first one. And God said to him, I choose you, and I'm going to make you into a great nation, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to give you all kinds of descendants, and I'm going to give you a land. God promised this to Abraham, the father of the Israelites. And so what did Abraham do? He picked up and he went. God said, go, and Abraham went. Why? Because Abraham trusted the God he couldn't see. And he went to a place that he couldn't see, a land he didn't yet know. He just packed up and went. But he believed God in faith, and he lived as a stranger in a strange land, even though God promised it to him. Abraham hung out in the promised land, even though it wasn't yet his. He hung out there. He was a stranger, a sojourner, an alien in today's language, in a land that wasn't yet his. In verse 11, we get to Abraham's wife, Sarah. I mean, you and I know Sarah was barren. She couldn't have any kids, and she had a baby in her 90s. I mean, that's like mind-boggling, okay? A baby in her 90s. And it was a miracle. And the text says she trusted God for this. Now, if you read this story, you know her faith grew. Because when God first told her this, she laughed. both Abraham and her just kind of laughed out loud at God. In fact, they named Isaac Laughter when he was born because they're like, there ain't no way that's happening. That's hilarious. Good one, God. And yet she grew in faith. She grew in her understanding. I mean, this is incredible. And so, therefore, in verse 12, one man, Abraham, and him as good as dead, he is so old, right? Like 1 foot in the grave. He was born descendants as many as the stars of the heaven, as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. Wow. And then in verse 11 or verse 13 to verse 16, the author of Hebrews stops. And he's been declaring us this hall of faith, and he stops and he gives us a little interlude. And he's going to make some comments now here in verse 13. He says, they didn't receive the things God promised them, verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised. At least not all of them. And specifically, I think the author is thinking about the land of Israel. He's thinking the land that God promised to Abraham. Abraham died and he didn't get it. Like he was still an alien, a sojourner in the land. And it would be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before they get the land. But Abraham did see the promised son, but not the whole nation. Abraham lived in the promised land, but he didn't possess it. He was one guy, a vast minority, living as a legal alien in the land. This wasn't his. But all these people trusted God's promises, even if they didn't see them fully realized, because these people of faith wanted something better than just the earthly land. They wanted a land that was heavenly. In other words, the author is telling us they wanted God himself more than anything this world had to offer. And he said these heroes of the faith were content to live as aliens in this world because their true homeland was somewhere else. In Peter, in one of his letters, he picks up in this idea and he calls us aliens and strangers in this world. As Christians, we can relate to Abraham because we have a possession that's better than anything in this world. The author of Hebrews is saying that these people of old, their faith led them to trust God. Now, he picks it back up after having paused for just a moment. He picks it back up, and he goes back to Abraham. And he says, let's talk about Abraham's faith a little bit more. Abraham's faith becomes a hallmark for the Apostle Paul in other passages. Like we see this over and over again. Abraham, verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. This time he goes to Genesis chapter 22. And I mean, God says to Abraham in Genesis 22, now Abraham has had the promised son, Isaac. And he says, take your son, your only son, and go offer him as a sacrifice to me. Oh, whoa. And this is the story, of course, of when Abraham was tested and he followed through and God stopped him and provided a ram instead of Isaac. Not only did Abraham love Isaac dearly, but Isaac was the promised son. And so when God said to him, go sacrifice your son, Abraham didn't know that a ram was going to be in the thicket as a substitute for his son. He didn't know that. He just knew God said to do it, and he went. But Abraham also knew something. God had promised that from Isaac, a great nation would come. And what the author of Hebrews does is he fills an important gap for us. He says what Abraham actually believed was that he would go and sacrifice his son. But because God promised that from Isaac would come a great nation, Abraham reasoned that if he did it in faith and obeyed, God would raise his son from the dead. Wow. That's quite the faith. And I just pause for a moment and go, do I trust God like that? Do I trust God like Abraham? Reasoning that God's promise was so secure that he must going to be raising my son from the dead. Whew! The author of Hebrews continues. Abraham's son Isaac does grow up, and Isaac grows up to trust the promise that the nation would go through him. So he passes on the blessing to Jacob, his son. And Jacob has a whole bunch of kids, and they all go down and end up in Egypt. And at the end of Jacob's life in Egypt, he passes on the blessing to his sons. And one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, who is the ruler now in Egypt, when he dies, he says, hey guys, guess what? I'm getting ready to die. Put my bones in a box when you're done. And in hundreds of years, he doesn't know how long, I know God promised us a land. And so we're going at some point to go back. And when we go back, take my bones with you. Because I want them buried in the promised land that God promised to give. Because he trusted God to fulfill his promise, even if he couldn't see it. The author continues through Old Testament history. Moses' parents, verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw the child was beautiful, and they weren't afraid of the king's edict. Moses' parents looked at him, and they hid Moses to save his life, trusting God rather than trusting the officials of the land that were slaughtering Jewish babies left and right. I always cracks me up here because they saw that the child was beautiful. It makes me ask, well, what if the child was ugly? Like, don't trust God for that one. It's a beautiful baby. Okay. That's trust, though. Moses then grows up and he refused to take the easy route and be identified as a son of Pharaoh. So he's identified with his Israelite brothers, and he paid a price for that. He trusted that identifying God's people was better. He left Egypt and hung out in the wilderness. Then he returned and he performed these miracles, concluding in the Passover. And he trusted when God said, the angel of death is coming to bring judgment, but if you take the blood and you put it on the doorpost, you will be saved. I'd be like, angel of death is coming to this land. I'm out. Give me my plane ticket and I'm leaving. But not Moses. He puts the blood on the doorpost and trusts God. It's trust. And then the people, verse 29, they come to the Red Sea, and there's a mountain of water on each side of them, and they walk right through it, trusting God. And then he fast forwards 40 years to the time when a new generation was going to take the land, and they come up on the town of Jericho, and they're getting ready to go in, and what do? They don't attack it. They don't build siege works to take down the wall. They just march around it a bunch of times and yell. And what happens? They trusted God, and the walls come down. And then he goes, oh, that makes me think of Rahab. Here's a woman of faith, a non-Israelite woman, a Gentile that knows nothing of God, but heard the stories of these Israelite people coming. And the spies come to her door and say, hey, will you hide us? And she thinks, well, if I'm found out, I'll be killed for hiding them. But you know what? I'm going to trust the God that I've never known or seen, and I'm going to hide you. I mean, that woman had faith. And then in verse 32 to 38, there's this flurry of activity. And he's just like rapid fire giving us examples of faith. Gideon, Barak. Gideon defeated an entire army by breaking glass jars. They just threw them on the ground and the army got scared and left. Why? Because they trusted God. Barak trusted God. And then all these judges, Samson, Jephthah, Samuel, some of these guys were morally questionable, to say the least. But they trusted the invisible power of God, of an unseen God. King David, man after God's own heart, he trusted God. All the prophets, they stood in face of opposition, punishment, as a consequence. And they believed that the consequence of facing people opposed to God was better than disobeying the God they couldn't see. And so they trusted God. And all these prophets, one after another, declared difficult things. I mean, we went through Jeremiah and we saw what Jeremiah suffered. I mean, he's thrown in a pit, sinks down in the miry pit in the mud, put in jail, tormented. These prophets over and over, this is how the world responded to them. And then faith, they said, I'll take whatever this world can throw at me. I believe in God, These men and women were awesome. I mean, the author keeps going. They won battles. These heroes of faith delivered justice, shut the mouths of lions, survived fire. They endured suffering. And because they had faith, not in the world they could see, but in the world they could not see. They had faith in God. Wow. I mean, it just blows me away. And I got to be honest here with you for a minute. For years, I have read this passage and I know I'm supposed to be encouraged by this. But I am not. Because I find this daunting, and I find myself inferior in every way, and there is no way I could have the faith like this. Could I, like Enoch, trust that God's going to sweep me up in the air and take me away? Would I build an ark for 120 years? No. Abraham, would God say, hey, move to the other side of the world, I'll show you when you get there? Okay. Would I do that? Moses, would I give up all the wealth of a palace to be counted poor with my brothers? Jericho, would I win a war by yelling at a wall? Really? Rahab, would I hide the spies even if my own hide was at risk? I mean, would I trust God enough to be sawn in half? He's talking about, I think, probably there about Isaiah, and Jewish tradition said that Isaiah was sawn in two. That's how he died. Wow, would I do that? And then Abraham. I mean, this is the big one for me. Would I be willing to plunge a knife into the chest of my son because I believed God would raise him from the dead? No. No. And I read Hebrews chapter 11 and I find discouragement. I don't have this kind of faith. And that's why this week, my world was turned a little bit upside down, at least my understanding of this passage, when I dwelt on these last two verses. In 30 years of ministry, I've never seen this before. And what's in the text, when we actually stop and think about it, what it means, it really turns this whole passage on its head for me. Because the hall of faith isn't supposed to make me feel inadequate. Quite the opposite. It's supposed to make me feel part of it all. Look at 39. Look what it says. And all these heroes of the faith, they were all commended through their faith. Okay, I got that. Yeah. I mean, way to go, faith people. But they did not receive what was promised. Wait, what? These are the most faith-filled people in the history of the entire whole story of the Bible, and they didn't get what was promised. Since God had provided something better for us. Wait, what? That apart from us, they should not be made perfect. They didn't get it. Why didn't they get what was promised to them? Because God had something better in mind. Not for them, but for you and for me. God gave us something better. He gave us Jesus. And these Old Testament figures longed to have what you have and what I have. They longed to understand that all their faith pointing forward to something, you and I get to look back at Jesus and see how the whole story is put together. These heroes of faith wanted to receive the promise that you and I have received because they need you to complete the story. You complete the faith of the heroes in the Hall of Faith. You see, the point is not for you and I just to sit back and go, wow, my faith stinks. The point is to know that you are the completion of a story. You are part of a team. You complete their faith. I don't know if you've ever thought, gosh, I just wish that I could live in the time of Jesus so I could see him. I'd have such a stronger faith. Or I wish I could have been at the Red Sea and seen the walls of water, and then I'd have a stronger faith. Or I wish I could have experienced the things of the Bible, then I'd really believe. Or I wish that I had the kind of faith that these women and men of faith had. But you're not supposed to feel inferior. Rather, you're supposed to realize that you're part of this story. And as much as that, they are a part of you. You are part of them. Look at it, says, they, apart from us, they should not be made perfect. You perfect the story. By perfect, he means complete. You complete their faith. You are in the hall of faith. That's you. Kevin, you're in the hall of faith. You're there, right there. You're in the hall of faith. This is powerful. Don't miss this stuff. We spend our days looking backwards and wishing we could be someone else or something else. They want to be you. You say, what do I have that these men and women didn't have? Well, you get to understand Jesus. You get to fully understand the gospel. You get to see how Jesus fulfilled all the promises of the Old Testament. You get to have the Holy Spirit living inside of you, something that these heroes of faith didn't get. You get to have the new covenant law written on your heart. You get to see how God's plan all comes together. You get to believe, having all the pieces put together for you, and somehow your faith perfects or completes the whole family of God from the beginning of Genesis to the end of Revelation, and you are the completion of the story. You belong in the hall of faith. You see, you're not supposed to look backwards and long for the faith of these men and women. They are looking forward at you and longing for you to finish what they started. And if you don't believe me, I'm going to give you a little preview to next week's sermon. Therefore, chapter 12, verse 1. Since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, they are cheering you on because they know you finished the faith story that they started. And they're cheering for you. They're not looking at you thinking, you stink, have more faith. No, they're cheering you on because you start part of the story. The point is not have more faith. The point is that Jesus perfects your faith. I love this. All right. There's a story in the Gospels that I think perfectly highlights this concept that the author of Hebrews is talking about. It's in Matthew 17. Jesus, with 3 or 4 of his disciples, goes up on the mountain, and all of a sudden, Moses and Elijah appear with Jesus. Okay, I think Moses clearly is in the hall of faith, and I think pretty clearly Elijah is referred to in this flurry of text. 2 figures from the hall of faith are there with him. I mean, this is cool stuff. Peter, James, and John, their faith is small. Like, they're not understanding what's going on. And Peter goes, hey, this is pretty cool, Jesus. Like, okay, I mean, Moses, he's awesome. Elijah, he's awesome. Let's put you on plane with them and let's build a little tribute to each one of you, because that's how awesome you are, Jesus. You're as good as Elijah and Moses. And then the voice of God comes. And he doesn't say, my servant Moses is awesome. No, he says, this is my son. Listen to him. And Moses and Elijah disappear. And all the glory is pointed to Jesus. And I think for the first time, maybe, Peter's like, oh, Jesus is God. Like, I'm getting this. But with Moses and Elijah gone, who's left with Jesus? The disciples. The 4 of them. Like, I think that the guys from the Hall of Faith The baton has been passed. And now we got these four guys. They're in the Hall of Faith because they believe who Jesus is. Okay, now, you know what the next thing that happens is? Matthew 17, they come down the mountain and the rest of the disciples are there and they're trying to heal this guy's kid and it's not working. And like the guy brings his kid to Jesus and they're like, what's wrong? And the disciples are like, what did we do wrong? We tried to do everything the way you told us, Jesus. And like, so they weren't on the mountain. They didn't see what happened. And Jesus then says this. They were like, why did this happen? He says, because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it'll move. Nothing will be impossible for you. You see, it's not the amount of your faith, it's the object of your faith. It's Jesus. You put all your trust in him, all your eggs in the Jesus basket. In this way, Jesus is greater than your faith. You see, it takes your small faith in him, and he takes that, and through the small faith, he puts you in a family that is made perfect. So next time you're feeling terrible about your faith, next time you feel like you just don't measure up, next time you feel like you don't have enough faith, do two things for me, would you? One, look to Jesus, because he is the perfecter of your faith. And then two, look to the heroes, not to be like them, but to remember you're continuing the story. To finish the race they started. To take the baton from them. So here's the one thing you should remember today. I saved it to the end for you. Don't be discouraged. Your faith is more important than you realize because you're in the family of faith. And you, yes you, are part of the story. Heavenly Father, thank you for the Hall of Faith, and thank you that we get to be part of the Hall of Faith. Thank you that you wrote this story with us in it. And I pray today that my brothers and sisters in Christ would be encouraged not in the amount of their faith, but in the object of your faith, Jesus, because you're better than anything we can put our hope in. We ask this in Jesus' name.